The sound came first, before anything else could be seen or understood, a distant murmur of children's voices bouncing off concrete walls, mixing with the shuffling of sneakers on metal bleachers and the occasional sharp whistle of a teacher calling for order. Somewhere in that echo, an elderly man cleared his throat, and a few isolated claps broke out too early, as if someone had mistaken anticipation for the show itself. The air smelled of chlorine and sunscreen and something older, something that had settled into the paint and the seats and the rails over decades of waiting. Then the water shifted, not with a splash, but with a slow, deliberado, displacemento, and she appeared beneath the surface like a shadow that had always been there. Her massive dark form gliding without urgency through the pale blue light. The crowd did not fall silent because they were told to. They fell silent because her presence demanded it, because something in the way she moved made every whisper feel like an intrusion. And if you stay until the end of this story, if you let yourself sink into what happened in that place and why it mattered, you will understand why some people left those bleachers changed and why others never stopped thinking about what they saw through that glass. The aquarium had been built in an era when such places were considered marvels of human achievement, when the idea of bringing the ocean into a landlocked city seemed like a gift to generations who might never see the real thing. The architecture showed its age in the way old photographs show theirs, with colors slightly faded and proportions that no longer matched modern expectations. The entrance was flanked by painted murals of dolphins and sea turtles, their expressions frozen in permanent cheerfulness, their bodies slightly disproportionate in the way that suggested an artist working from memory rather than observation. Families arrived in station wagons, and later in minivans, and later still in SUVs, each generation carrying different cameras and different snacks but wearing the same expression of anticipation as they passed through the turnstiles. The gift shop sold stuffed animals with oversized eyes and t-shirts that would shrink after 3 washes and snow globes that trapped tiny plastic whales in eternal suspension, shaken by children's hands and then forgotten on bedroom shelves for years. The main stadium was the heart of the place. A vast bowl of blue and white seats arranged in rising tiers around a central pool that seemed impossibly large until you realized what lived inside it. The water was kept at precise temperatures and treated with chemicals that made it clearer than any ocean, a manufactured perfection that allowed spectators to see deep into the pool where the whale moved in her endless circuits. She had been there longer than most of the staff could remember, longer than the current management had been in charge, longer than some of the trees in the parking lot had been standing. Her arrival was recorded in old documents stored in filing cabinets that no one opened anymore. Her transport from distant waters, documented in photographs that showed men in different uniforms using equipment that now looked primitive. She had been smaller then, though still enormous by any human standard, and the tank that seemed adequate for her juvenile form had not grown as she had grown. Morning light entered the stadium through high windows, casting moving patterns on the water that shifted with the clouds outside. The first shows of the day drew school groups, yellow buses lined up in the parking lot like caterpillars waiting for transformation, teachers clutching clipboards and counting heads with the weariness of people who had done this exact thing many times before. The children arrived in waves of noise, their excitement uncontainable, their voices rising and falling in chaotic rhythms that bounced off every surface and created a wall of sound that was both overwhelming and strangely comforting. They carried backpacks decorated with cartoon characters and wore matching t-shirts that identified their schools, and they pushed against each other for the best seats near the front, where the splash zone promised the thrill of getting wet. She heard them before they saw her. The sound traveled through the water in ways that human ears could not track, vibrations that reached her long before any eye could spot her form in the depths. She had learned to associate certain frequencies with certain times of day, the higher pitches of children with morning hours, the lower murmurs of adult groups with afternoons, the near silence of maintenance crews with the dark hours when the stadium lights were dimmed. Her brain processed these sounds in ways that scientists still debated, filing them into categories that had no human names but served purposes that kept her oriented in a world without natural landmarks. The concrete walls of her tank returned every sound she made with a consistency that natural environments never provided, an echo that told her the same story every time she asked. The trainers entered through side doors wearing wetsuits and carrying buckets of fish, their movements practiced and efficient as they took their positions around the pool. The audience did not see the hours of preparation that preceded each show, the careful measurement of food portions, and the assessment of the whale's mood, and the coordination between multiple team members who communicated through hand signals and radio. They saw only the result, the synchronized dance of human and animal that appeared effortless precisely because of how much effort had gone into making it so. The lead trainer was always the one who entered the water, a decision based on years of relationship building and a trust that could not be manufactured or rushed. The whale knew this trainer's voice from all others, could distinguish their heartbeat from the heartbeats of strangers, could sense their presence before they appeared at the pool's edge. The show began with music, a carefully selected soundtrack that built anticipation through tempo and volume, guiding the audience's emotions like a conductor guiding an orchestra. The whale's first appearance was always timed to a crescendo, her massive body rising from the depths just as the music reached its peak, and the crowd responded with gasps and applause that they had been conditioned to provide. Without knowing they had been conditioned at all, she performed the behaviors she had been trained to perform. The jumps and spins and tail slaps that sent water cascading into the front rows, and the children screamed with delight while the parents fumbled with their cameras, trying to capture something that could not be captured, trying to preserve a moment that was already passing into memory. But there were always those who watched differently. In every audience, scattered among the enthusiastic men, there were individuals who sat quietly with their hands in their laps, their eyes following the whale's movements with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something the others missed. Sometimes it was a child, strangely still among fidgeting classmates, their face pressed against the seat in front of them as they watched without blinking. Sometimes it was an elderly person, someone who had perhaps seen too much of life to be impressed by spectacle, someone who looked at the whale, not with wonder, but with something closer to recognition. The whale noticed these still points in the sea of movement, these silent observers in the chorus of noise, and something in her altered when she passed them. A slight tilt of her head or a momentary pause in her swimming that no one could prove was intentional, but that happened too often to be coincidence. There was one morning when a girl in the third row did not clap. The show had reached its halfway point, the moment when the whale was supposed to emerge and accept a fish from the trainer's hand, while the audience showed their appreciation. But this girl sat with her arms wrapped around herself, her face expressionless, her eyes locked on the water with an intensity that seemed to cost her something. Her classmates clapped and cheered on either side of her, their bodies bouncing with excitement, but she remained motionless, a stone in a stream, an anchor in a current. Her teacher noticed and leaned down to whisper something, probably an instruction to participate, probably a gentle nudge toward conformity. But the girl did not respond. She was watching the whale, and the whale, in that moment, was watching her. The behavior that followed was not part of the show. The whale was supposed to return to the center of the pool and prepare for the next sequence, a series of synchronized movements with a second trainer that required precise timing and positioning. Instead, she deviated from her path, swimming toward the edge of the pool closest to where the girl sat, her massive body casting a shadow that fell across the front rows like an eclipse. The trainers exchanged glances, their hands moving in signals that the audience could not interpret, their faces maintaining smiles that had become slightly fixed. The whale positioned herself at the glass barrier, her eye visible just above the waterline, and she remained there for 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats longer than any pause in the choreography allowed. The audience did not know what to do with this silence. Applause stuttered and stopped. Conversations that had been whispered beneath the music's cover became audible in the sudden quiet. Someone laughed nervously, and the sound seemed to hang in the air like a wrong note. The girl in the third row did not move, did not speak, did not look away from the whale's eye. And whatever passed between them in that moment was witnessed by hundreds, but understood by none. Then the music resumed, louder than before, and the trainers called the whale back to center stage. And the show continued as if nothing had happened, as if the script had never been interrupted, as if the silence had been just another planned effect. But the girl was different when she left. Her classmates filed out through the stadium exits, their voices still high with excitement, their hands sticky with ice cream purchased at intermission, their minds already moving on to the next attraction on their itinerary. She walked among them, but not with them, her steps slower, her eyes distant, her mouth set in a line that could have been sadness or could have been something else entirely. Her teacher called her name twice before she responded. And when she finally looked up, there was something in her expression that the teacher chose not to examine too closely. Some moments demand acknowledgement, and some moments demand the opposite, a silent agreement to let certain experiences remain unspoken. The seasons turned, and the whale remained. Summer brought crowds that filled every seat, Families on vacation seeking air-conditioned relief from the heat outside, tourists checking items off their lists of local attractions. Fall brought school groups again. Different children wearing different t-shirts but carrying the same backpacks and making the same noise. Winter brought smaller audiences, dedicated visitors who came because they wanted to, not because they had been assigned to come. People who sat in the cold bleachers and watched the whale move through water that was always the same temperature, regardless of what was happening outside. Spring brought renewal, at least in theory. New marketing campaigns and refurbished concession stands, and fresh paint on the murals that were starting to look their age. Through all of this, she swam her circuits. The pool that had seemed large when she arrived had become small around her growing body, and her turns at the edges grew tighter each year, her movements more economical as she learned to navigate the boundaries that would never expand. She knew every crack in the concrete, every discoloration in the paint, every spot where the glass was thicker or thinner or had been replaced after some incident that the records did not fully document. The geography of her world was fixed and final, and she had memorized it so completely that she could have navigated it with her eyes closed, which, in the darkness of night, when the stadium lights were off, she sometimes did. The sounds changed over the years in ways that marked time more reliably than any calendar. The music that accompanied the shows was updated periodically. Old songs replaced by new ones that reflected changing tastes and licensing agreements. The cameras that clicked in the audience evolved from mechanical shutters to digital silence to the ubiquitous soft sound of smartphone captures that multiplied with each passing year. The voices of the trainers changed as staff members came and went, some lasting for years and becoming almost as familiar as the whale's own heartbeat, others appearing for a season and then vanishing into whatever lives awaited them beyond the stadium walls. Children who had visited as toddlers returned as teenagers, their voices deeper, their enthusiasm more carefully guarded, their memories of that first visit uncertain but persistent. There was an afternoon, many years after the morning with the silent girl, when an elderly man sat alone in the upper reaches of the bleachers. He had purchased a single ticket, refused the offer of a seat closer to the front, and climbed the stairs with the careful deliberation of someone who knew exactly where they wanted to be. He carried no camera, no snacks, no souvenirs. He wore a jacket despite the warmth of the stadium, and he sat with his hands on his knees, watching the pool below with an expression that suggested he was not entirely present. That part of him was somewhere else, someone else. The show proceeded as it always proceeded, the music building, the whale performing, the audience responding with trained enthusiasm. But this man did not clap. He did not lean forward when the whale jumped. He did not shield his face when the spray reached even his distant seat. He simply watched, his eyes following the whale's movements with the same intensity that the girl had shown all those years ago. And when the whale deviated from her path, when she once again swam toward the edge of the pool and paused at the glass, it was toward his section of the bleachers that she oriented herself. No one else noticed. The attention of the crowd was directed by the trainers, focused on the center of the pool where the next sequence was supposed to occur. And the whale's positioning seemed like a momentary aberration, a brief rest before the continuation of the scheduled program. But the man noticed. He sat up straighter in his seat, his hands gripping his knees more tightly, his breath visible for a moment in the air-conditioned chill, even though it had not been visible before. He was seeing something that the others could not see, recognizing something that the others could not recognize. And when the whale's eye found his, through the distance and the glass and the years, something in his face shifted. He left before the show ended. The staff member at the exit would later remember him, would describe to colleagues how he had walked past without a word, how he had paused at the door to look back once toward the pool, how he had seemed to be carrying something invisible but heavy. They would speculate about his story, construct theories that ranged from the mundane to the melodramatic, but none of their guesses would be correct, because the truth of what he had experienced was not something that could be guessed at. Some moments are private even when they occur in public, personal even when they are witnessed by hundreds, and what had passed between the old man and the whale belonged to a category of experience that had no name and needed none. The years accumulated like sediment, like layers in rock, like rings in a tree that no one would ever cut down accounts. The aquarium changed ownership twice, was threatened with closure once, was saved by a fundraising campaign that brought temporary relief but not permanent security. The whale's name appeared in newspapers and on television, sometimes in stories that celebrated her intelligence and beauty, sometimes in stories that questioned the ethics of her captivity, sometimes in stories that simply needed a local angle and found her convenient. She was loved by people who had never met her and criticized by people who claimed to speak on her behalf. And through all of it, she continued to swim her circles, continued to hear the sounds of human audiences, continued to observe the world that came to observe her. The decline, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no single moment when her health failed, no spectacular crisis that made headlines and drew crowds of mourners to the stadium gates. Instead, there was a gradual dimming, a slow reduction in the energy that had once powered her leaps and spins, a subtle change in the rhythm of her movements that only the most attentive observers could detect. The trainers noticed first, documented their concerns in reports that moved up through layers of management, consulted with veterinarians who offered treatment options and uncertain prognoses. The shows were modified to accommodate her limitations, the jumps eliminated first, then the spins, then most of the movements that had once defined the spectacle that bore her name. The audiences changed too, though it was unclear whether this was cause or effect. The crowds grew smaller, the applause less thunderous, the energy in the stadium more subdued. People spoke in lower voices, moved with more deliberation, looked at the whale with expressions that contained something that had not been there before. It was as if the entire place had begun to understand, without anyone saying it explicitly, that what they were witnessing was not just a show, but a passage, not just entertainment, but something closer to farewell. Children who had once screamed with delight now sat quietly, picking up on cues from adults who themselves were not fully aware of what they were transmitting. The final months were marked by a strange tenderness that settled over the aquarium like fog. Staff members who had worked there for years began to linger after their shifts, finding excuses to pass by the main pool, to stand at the glass and watch the whale move through her diminished routines. Visitors who had come, expecting the spectacle they remembered from years before, found something different, something quieter, something that they struggled to describe when they returned home and tried to explain their experience. The gift shop still sold the stuffed animals and the t-shirts and the snow globes, but the purchases felt different somehow, more like remembrances than souvenirs, more like talismans than toys. There was one last show, though it was not announced as such and was not recognized as such until afterward. The stadium was half full, a midweek audience composed mostly of retirees and young parents, with toddlers too young to remember what they were seeing. The music played at a lower volume than usual, and the trainers moved with a gentleness that suggested they knew something the audience did not. The whale appeared on cue, her body still massive but somehow diminished. Her movements still graceful but visibly slower, her eyes still bright but carrying a depth that seemed to have no bottom. She performed what she could perform, and the audience applauded what they saw, but there were no gasps, no screams, no moments of overwhelming excitement. Instead, there was a kind of respectful attention, a collective witnessing that felt more like a ceremony than an entertainment. When the show ended and the trainers took their bows, when the music faded and the audience began to gather their belongings, there was a moment when everyone seemed to pause simultaneously, as if waiting for something more, as if sensing that what had just ended was more than a show. The whale remained at the surface longer than usual, her breathing visible as a faint mist that rose and dispersed in the still air of the stadium. The last visitors to leave turned back at the exit to look at her one more time, and she seemed to return their gaze, seemed to acknowledge their attention with something that could have been gratitude or could have been simply the habit of a lifetime spent being watched. Then the lights began to dim, and the doors closed, and the stadium settled into the quiet that always came after the crowds departed. And she was alone with the water and the walls and the sounds that would continue until they stopped. The morning after was unremarkable by any external measure. The sun rose as it always rose. The staff arrived as they always arrived. The preparations for the day's first show began as they always began. But somewhere in that routine, there was an absence that could not be filled. A silence that could not be broken. A space that had been occupied for so long that its emptiness seemed impossible. The trainers found her still, her body floating in the pale blue light, her eye closed, her form finally at rest after decades of movement. They did what they had been trained to do, followed protocols that had been written for this eventuality, made calls that had been rehearsed but never made. The news spread through the aquarium first, then through the community, then through networks of people who had known her name or visited her pool or simply carried some memory of a moment when they had sat in those bleachers and watched her move through the water. There were expressions of grief, and expressions of relief, and expressions of anger. All the responses that such news inevitably generates, all the opinions that such a life inevitably accumulates. But beneath all of it, beneath the statements and the tributes and the debates that would continue long after, there was something simpler, something that did not require words, something that was felt rather than articulated. She had been there, for decades, for generations, for longer than many of the buildings in the city had been standing. She had been there. Children had grown to adults who had brought their own children who had grown to adults themselves, and through all of it, she had been there, swimming her circles, hearing their voices, meeting their eyes through glass that separated worlds that could never truly touch. She had become a fixed point in a universe of change, a constant in a reality that had no other constants, a presence that anchored the memories of countless people who had never thought to question what her presence costs or what her silence meant. The pool was drained, eventually. The stadium closed for renovations that were described as improvements but felt to some like erasure. The murals were repainted, the seats replaced, the gift shop restocked with new merchandise that featured new images, new names, new attractions that the aquarium hoped would draw new crowds. The official history of the place was updated to include her, a paragraph here, a photograph there, a plaque in a corner that most visitors would never notice. She became part of the past, as all living things eventually become, and the present moved on as the present always does. But there were those who remembered differently. There were people who, years later, would find themselves pausing at unexpected moments, their minds suddenly filled with the image of blue water and a dark shape moving through it. They would be sitting at dinner or walking through a park or lying awake at night, and something would trigger the memory, some sound or smell or quality of light, and they would be back in those bleachers, watching her move, feeling whatever they had felt in that original moment of witnessing. They could not explain why the memory persisted, could not articulate what made it different from other memories of other places and other times. But they knew it was different, knew it had marked them in some way that defied analysis. The silent girl had become a woman by then, had built a life that had nothing to do with aquariums or whales, had rarely spoken of that morning when she had sat in the third row and refused to clap. But she remembered. She remembered the weight of attention when the whale had turned toward her, remembered the length of that pause that had seemed to stretch beyond normal time, remembered the feeling of being seen by something vast and unknowable and somehow familiar. She had carried that moment with her through years of school and work and relationships and losses, had never fully understood what it meant, had never tried to explain it to anyone who asked about the distant look that sometimes crossed her face. The elderly man, if he was still alive, carried his own version of that weight. Whatever he had recognized when the whale's eye found his, whatever connection he had felt across the distance of the bleachers and the glass, it had become part of his story in ways that only he could know. Perhaps he had visited before, in younger years, had sat in those same seats and watched that same whale when both of them were at the beginning of their journeys rather than the end. Perhaps the recognition he had felt was the recognition of a shared experience, a parallel life, an understanding that transcended the differences between their forms. Or perhaps it was something simpler, something that did not require explanation, something that was true precisely because it could not be proven. The aquarium continued to operate, drawing visitors who knew nothing of what had come before, entertaining children who would carry their own memories into their own futures. New animals arrived to fill the tanks that the whale had left behind, and new shows were developed to showcase new talents, and new merchandise was designed to capture new imaginations. The cycle continued, as cycles do, each generation believing they were seeing something unique while actually participating in something ancient. Each audience believing they were the first to feel what countless audiences had felt before. But the place was different. Anyone who had known it before could sense the difference, could feel the absence that no new attraction could fill. The sounds were the same, the smells were the same, the patterns of light on water were the same, but something essential was missing, something that had anchored the experience and given it weight. The new audiences did not know what they were missing, could not miss something they had never known, and perhaps that was a kind of mercy. They could enjoy what was there without mourning what was gone, could create their own memories without the shadow of older memories falling across them. Yet the building itself seemed to remember. The concrete walls that had contained her for so long, the glass that had mediated between her world and theirs, the very architecture that had been built to showcase her. All of it retained some trace of her presence, some echo of her passage. Staff members who worked late would sometimes pause at the empty pool, would sometimes feel something they could not name, would sometimes hear sounds that had no source, would sometimes see, in the corner of their vision, a shadow moving through water that was no longer there. This is what places become when something significant has lived and died within them. They become containers for memory, vessels for experience, monuments to moments that can never be recovered but that refuse to be forgotten. The whale had crossed that aquarium in silence for decades, her presence explaining to each visitor why that place mattered. And now her absence explained something else, something about the temporary nature of all presence, something about the permanence of all departure, something about the way that life leaves marks on the places it inhabits, marks that persist long after the life itself has ended. If you've watched until now, if you have followed this story from its beginning to its end, then you understand something that cannot be taught but only experienced. You understand that some stories are not about their endings, but about their duration. Not about their conclusions, but about their continuance. Not about what happened, but about what it meant while it was happening. The whale is gone, and the aquarium continues. And the world moves on, as the world always does. But somewhere in the space between memory and forgetting, between presence and absence, between what was and what is, she still swims her endless circles, still hears the sounds of distant audiences, still meets the eyes of silent observers who recognize something in her that they cannot name. The bleachers are empty now, at least in the imagination that this story has created. The water is still, the lights are dim, and the only sound is the ghost of sound. The memory of all those voices, all those claps, all those moments of wonder and confusion and recognition that accumulated over the years like layers of meaning, like sediment in deep water, like the weight of a life that was lived in view of other lives. That mattered because it was witnessed, that ended but did not disappear. She was there, and then she was not. And the distance between those two states is the distance that all of us must eventually cross. The silence that all of us must eventually enter. The absence that all of us must eventually become. But the story does not end with absence. It ends with what remains after absence, with the traces that persist, with the memories that continue to surface in unexpected moments. It ends with a woman who once was a girl, sitting quietly in an ordinary room, suddenly seeing blue water and a dark shape and an eye that seemed to know her. It ends with an old man's last thoughts, turning toward a pool he visited decades ago, finding peace in the memory of a connection he never understood. It ends with children not yet born who will never see her, but who might someday stand at the edge of a different ocean and feel something stir within them. Some ancestral memory, some inherited wonder, some recognition that the world contains creatures too large for us to comprehend and too significant for us to forget. The aquarium was just a building. The pool was just concrete and water. The shows were just entertainment, designed to fill seats and sell merchandise and generate the revenue that kept the operation running. But she was not just anything. She was a life, a mind, a presence that altered every space she entered and every person who encountered her. She was proof that the boundaries between species are more permeable than we pretend. That communication happens in registers we cannot measure. That meaning emerges in the spaces between words, between gestures, between the beats of hearts that are different but not incompatible. The silence she carried was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, the silence of a vessel so complete that nothing more could be added. She had absorbed the sounds of generations, had witnessed the passage of countless lives, had served as a mirror in which human beings saw reflections they could not always understand. Her silence was the silence of observation, of patience, of a wisdom that did not announce itself because it did not need to be announced. Those who could hear it knew what it meant. Those who could not hear it received something else, something that met them where they were and gave them what they were ready to receive. Now, subscribe. If this story has meant something to you, stay until the very end of every video, because endings are where meanings gather, where threads come together, where the patience of attention is rewarded with understanding. The whale knew this. She knew that those who stayed, who watched, who refused to leave when others left, were the ones who would see what was truly there. She knew that presence is a gift that requires reception, that observation is a practice that rewards dedication, that the truth of any experience emerges only for those who give it the time it demands. The morning sounds return in the imagination, in the memory, in the story that has no end because it has become part of you now. Children's voices echo in a distance that is not measured in meters but in years. Teachers call for quiet that never quite arrives. An elderly person clears their throat in preparation for something that will never be spoken. Scattered applause breaks out, premature and hopeful, greeting a presence that has not yet appeared but that everyone knows will appear. Because it always has, because it always did, because for one long moment in the history of a place and the life of a creature, it seemed like it always would. And then she appears in the memory, in the imagination, in the place where stories go when they are no longer being told but are not yet forgotten. She appears as she always appeared, rising from the depths with a grace that mocked the limitations of her environment, meeting the light with an eye that had seen everything and judged nothing. Moving through the water as if the water were not a prison but a palace, as if the concrete walls were not boundaries but frames for a portrait that would outlast them all. She crosses the pool in silence. The crowd watches. Somewhere in the bleachers, a child does not clap. Somewhere else, an old man sits alone with his hands on his knees. The trainers signal to each other. The music swells and fades. The show continues along its predetermined path, but she has already deviated, has already paused, has already found the eyes that were looking for her and given them what they came to receive. The moment passes. The show ends. The crowd disperses. The day becomes night, becomes day, becomes years, becomes memory, becomes story, becomes this. These words, this attempt to capture what cannot be captured, to preserve what has already been lost, to explain what the whale's presence explained, which was simply this, that some places matter because of what lives in them, that some lives matter because of where they are lived, that the meaning we seek is not found in explanations, but in presence, not in answers, but in the quality of attention we bring to questions that have no answers. The aquarium still stands. The pool has been refilled. New creatures swim in waters that do not remember her, entertaining new crowds who do not know what they are not seeing. The gift shop has been renovated, the murals repainted, the seats replaced with newer models that are more comfortable but somehow less permanent. The world has moved on, as the world must, and only those who carry the memory know what has been lost, know what that place once contained. Know why the silence of a whale crossing an artificial pool could explain more about meaning than any words ever could.